back to Guide to the Global Economy. I'm Josh Lipsky, Director of the GeoEconomics Center here at the Atlantic Council. On this episode, we're going to go through inflation around the world. There's been some claims about how fast it's coming down in different countries. We're going to show you what's true and what's not. And then we're going to look at Egypt, what's happening inside the Egyptian economy, the deals they're making both with the IMF and some of their neighbors. But first, I want to turn to Alisha Chhangani, Program Assistant here with us at the GeoEconomics Center, to talk about recession in some of the world's largest economies. Alisha, what did we find this week?
Yeah, so Josh, when we started kind of the lead process, the news broke out that Japan had lost its position as the third world's largest economy. So we wanted to take a broader look. What was happening with these economies, what's happening in the G7, and that's where we turned to Germany, UK, and Japan.
Let's take a look.
Yes,
All right, there's a lot of data.
a lot of data. So let's talk through this. So right about in 2023, we found out that in Q3 and Q4, Japan, Germany, and the UK faced a technical recession.
Now remind us, Econ 101, what's a technical recession?
Consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth.
Okay.
And at the time that we did this research, and Josh, we'll go back to this, all three countries were facing a technical recession.
So that's half the G7, basically.
Yeah. And what we wanted to look at, that this wasn't happening, what was happening, in history. So we wanted to take a look back, and we went to about 1960, and we found that this has never happened before outside of the global financial crisis. So these three countries have never been in a technical recession since before 1960.
I mean, just to think about that for a second. So you go back 65 years, post-World War II boom, of course, Germany and Japan at that point undergoing massive recoveries as their economies are rebuilding, but never those three economies, Japan, Germany, the UK, in recession at the same time, outside the time most of the world was in recession in the global financial crisis.
And I think a question that people are going to ask is, what about 2020 and COVID-19? But Japan, its growth accelerated and actually recovered very, very quickly. And so again, technically they weren't in a technical recession at the same time.
Because even if they had a terrible quarter, they recovered enough that they didn't have two negative consecutive quarters. But it's not all recessions are created equal. There are different things going on in Japan, Germany, and the UK. Let's start with Germany. What's happening there?
So Germany is still dealing with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, has really weak demand, competition in EVs, electric vehicles, and it's dealing with that in its economy. UK, obviously, post-Brexit labor shortages, has very sluggish productivity, so it hasn't been able to recover in that portion.
So these are different situations, Germany and the UK. I mean, Germany, energy prices, as you said, the invasion, and then Brexit related for UK. And let's talk Japan, because that's always the most interesting macroeconomic story of the G7.
Yes. So at the time that we did this research, Japan had about negative 0.4% GDP growth. So obviously we were able to put them in our research as a technical recession. But Josh, as we found out, they revised their data and they were able to grow a tad bit at 0.4% at the end.
Yeah, the timeline on this is important. We pushed this out Sunday night. Yes. Not 6 hours later, the Japanese released revised data, obviously not because of our research, and they were no longer in technical recession. Yes. But whether it's negative 0.4 or positive 0.4, it's very sluggish or stalled growth. So what's happening in the economy?
Very interesting case. So Japan has both an aging population and a declining population that are both consuming less and participating less in the labor market. Japan has an average age of 49, has the largest proportion of elderly citizens in the country. And the interesting stat that we found is that by 2050, Japan is set to lose about 15% of its population.
This is, I mean, for an economy cannot grapple with that kind of change over a relatively short time period, 25 years. That's a major headwind facing the Japanese economy.
But I think something that we talked about when we were doing the research process was like, these things aren't happening in silos. There's a broader G7 story that we can look at, and we talked about kind of US growth and Chinese GDP problems.
Well, that's what's interesting to me, because if you think back the historical look that you and the team did here, in a lot of these cases, what I think helped the UK, Germany, Japan recover the times they did have recessions or weak growth was that later, post 2005, 2006, China was rapidly growing. And earlier in the 60s and 70s, the US was rapidly growing. Neither of those things are the case now. And that, to me, is a little concerning if you think of how these countries are going to get out of this sluggish growth cycle.
Right. And the US has been the fastest growing G7 economy, but it's not expected to surge. That growth is expected to slow down. And so,
and we know China has its own economic issues to grapple with this year.
it looks like these countries have to kind of deal with these, stimulating their economies by themselves.
Yeah, I think that's really the key takeaway here. If it's going to be fixed, it's going to be fixed from within. Alisha, thanks so much for looking into it. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
For Under the Radar, I want to turn to Sophia Busch, Assistant Director with us at the GeoEconomics Center. Sophia, we looked at Egypt this week for Under the Radar, obviously an economy that's had a lot of economic issues going back years. What's the latest?
Right. So Egypt has had a lot of economic issues for quite some time, but we really wanted to look now because there's obviously so much regional instability. Egypt has inflation at almost 40% right now. The pound just tumbled against the dollar. It's not a pretty picture. There's, the foreign reserves are run down. Everyone knows this.
It's a dire situation and it's getting worse.
Right. But it's so important right now because, people say Egypt is too big to fail in terms of regional instability.
And they're thinking about all the geopolitics that are happening, Israel, Gaza, Egypt's role in that, all the dynamics.
So it's really an important time for Egypt to hopefully be doing well.
So what have they done? How have they tried to manage the situation?
Yeah, so there have been some new deals recently, but also they've been working through this for quite some time. So in December 2022, they signed an IMF program, but it's taken really the last year for them to finally, make everything happen so they can
And actually get the money, right?
Which just happened, and they expanded the program. It was originally $3 billion, and now it's $8 billion.
And I don't mean to suggest that $8 billion is not a lot of money, but given the economic issues that you addressed, it's not enough.
No, I think so. Egypt's, debt payments, it's around like 160 billion.
Yeah,
so 8 billion, it's a lot, but it's really just scratching the surface.
So what other deals are on the table? What are they trying to do?
So about a week before the IMF program, the UAE actually signed a deal worth 35 billion upfront, essentially. And it's sort of a different type because it's essentially a property development deal.
Okay.
With the Ras Al Hikma coast, which is, it's, if you look it up on Google Maps, it's really beautiful, just crystal clear water. So this is going to be
viewers to Google it and look up the property.
Yeah, but so this is like a new tourist destination that they're.
So, just so I understand, this is, when the IMF lends money, they say, here's money and we want you to take on these various structural reforms in your economy, spend less in this area. This is the UAE making a deal with Egypt to lease land, essentially.
Yes, lease it and develop it, and Egypt would get around 30% of the profits.
Okay, that's an interesting new strategy.
Yeah.
Any other deals on the table like that, or other avenues they're pursuing?
So there's rumors also that the Saudis might be pursuing a similar deal for the Ras Gamila coast. So it's a very similar model, but that's still just rumors. So we're waiting on that.
But so you have UAE, Saudi with their own dynamics between those two countries, making different deals with Egypt potentially, as you say, in the Saudi Arabia's case.
But then there's also, we just got news from the FT that the EU is actually also planning on sending essentially humanitarian aid to manage refugee flows. So that's kind of a different direction, but still like that external funding coming in.
But it all goes to your point that whether you're the IMF or you're the EU or you're UAE or Saudi Arabia, these countries feel like Egypt is too big to fail. Everyone is trying to make some kind of financial arrangement.
Yes, definitely.
So what should we look at going forward?
I think the big question here is really if this is going to last. It seems like, okay, there's all of this funding coming in. This seems like it should help relieve the situation, but is this going to be a sustainable shift? Is Egypt really turning a corner? And I think for that to happen, you need systemic reform.
What's so interesting, because I'm thinking of the earlier part of the episode where Alisha was here, we were talking about historical changes and GDP growth in the G7. If you think of the 60s and 70s, Egypt was a strong economy in the region comparatively, and now it needs support from countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia. There's just these kind of reversals, I feel like, going on in the global economy. And the question is what's going to happen going forward.
Yeah, so I think in Egypt's case, there is some reason to be legitimately optimistic. Ever since the IMF's program was signed last year, that came with, those structural reforms that we were talking about. And really, for the first time, they've strongly addressed state ownership and also military ownership.
Well, this is a huge issue in a range of countries, but especially Egypt.
Right, and it looks so far like Egypt is following the recommendations and creating these more long-lasting changes from, reducing the state budget for state investment projects, but also decreasing the tax exemptions related with that.
Okay, well, that's potentially a positive development long-term for Egypt. We'll continue to track it. Sophia, thanks so much for looking into it for us.
Yeah, of course.
For By the Numbers this week, I want to bring in Mrugank Bhusari, Assistant Director with us at the GeoEconomics Center. Gank, what's the big number this week?
Josh, it's 41st place.
That's 41st place. Okay, now this comes out of a conversation that happened on the Hill last week. Jay Powell, chair of the Federal Reserve, was testifying to Congress. He was asked by a congressman, is inflation coming down faster in the U.S. than anywhere else on the planet?
Yeah.
He hesitated.
He hesitated and he was not sure. He did end up saying yes, but that is not actually the case. The US is actually in 41st place.
Let's take a look.
Yes. And so what we did was we compared inflation in every country around the world starting in January 2023 and comparing how they've fared since. And the US has been very impressive. I mean, coming down from 9% in mid-22 to 3%-ish, what it is today. But other countries have done an even faster job at reducing inflation.
And in fairness to Powell and the question, we don't know what time frame they were, over a 2-year period, perhaps the answer is closer to yes, we could evaluate that. But at least over the last year, how we measured it, the answer was no.
Yeah, and in fact, Josh, that number right there is a zero. A lot of countries are not even inflating, they're actually deflating. Look at China, Thailand.
Let's talk about China for a second. Deflation, struggling economy, obviously.
Yes, the economy is going through some major problems right now, and they really hope to be inflating because they're trying to think of stimulus and other things that they could do to get the economy back running and inflating.
What's interesting about this chart to me was we didn't do the typical, let's look at the G7, let's look at the G20. You took a range of different kind of economies, small, medium, large. We have Morocco, we have Peru. Why did you think of it that way when you did the data?
So Josh, inflation is, every country has its own underlying dynamics of inflation. Some places the central bank is aggressive, some places it is not. Smaller economies always find it harder to set their own macroeconomic environment because a lot of it is dependent on the Fed itself or the ECB. And so we wanted to get a sample from different continents, different kinds of economies to get a full sense of how is the US performing in terms of other countries, especially because the question was, is the US faster than any other country on the planet?
It caught our attention because it's just such an interesting way to frame the question, the planet, when you think of it that way. Okay, let's talk about the US specifically. If you look at this graph, some people have felt, and we should say this is before the latest CPI release data, which came out yesterday, that the pace of inflation reduction is stalling in the US. What are the underlying components in inflation that you're seeing?
So in fact, the latest inflation CPI numbers was an increase of 0.1% on an annual basis to 3.2%. And on a year-on-year basis, this inflation is being driven mainly by the services sector, so transport service, motor car insurance, health services. And on a month-to-month basis, it's actually it's energy. Energy has driven the increase in the last month itself.
And energy is very volatile, so this could change a lot in the coming weeks. What's the next big data release we should look for? Because the Fed meeting's coming up next week.
So the Fed meeting is coming up next week, and so the Fed, to set its interest rates, always looks at the PCE, which is the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index, and this is separate from the CPI, which is the Consumer
Price
index.
What it means is that the Fed doesn't actually, in theory, look at this data. They have another measurement they like to look at. On the other hand, it all sort of helps create the picture.
The reason that distinction is important is because the PCE data comes at the end of the month, which is after the Fed's meeting, which is in next week.
Yeah.
And so they, even though they don't look at CPI as the main variable of interest, they will certainly be influenced by the fact that CPI has actually gone up, even though it's just by 0.1%.
I mean, you've made this point, Gunk. We've talked about this. Inflation's come down a lot, but that last mile is hard to get it back down, right?
Yeah. So just like I said, coming from 9% to 3% is really impressive, and it is really a major feat. But it is just as difficult to get from 3% to the Fed's target of 2%, because you now are dealing with, you have questions of should we start decreasing interest rates to reinvigorate the economy? Yeah. And if you do that too soon, you again might have a resurgence of inflation. In fact, that's what happened in the 1980s. Inflation had come down to a large extent, and then inflation went right back up.
We know, that this lives in the Fed's memory like a scar, the Volcker era before that, that not have this repeated, the double dip situation. Yeah. On the other hand, you don't want to keep monetary policy too tight. I mean, you heard President Biden address this in the State of the Union. Interest rates are very high, prevents people from being able to get mortgages. There are all ripple effects when you have very tight monetary policy.
The elections are also coming up. That's another reason why the economic indicators, I mean, we've seen a lot of analysis on how the economic indicators are divorced from how people are actually feeling. But at the same time, those indicators give a lot of information about what's happening in the economy at a larger scale. One of the reasons inflation was so high, like you mentioned, Josh, is that there was a lot of COVID stimulus, and a lot of people had a lot of money and not too much to spend it on, especially not on services during COVID. But then there's also supply chain issues, which is that since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, energy became really expensive, and a lot of other supply chain issues. In 2021, in fact, there were a lot of port issues and a lot of issues in China. So there was just a lot happening in the supply chains that have now eased.
Issues that have eased. What's interesting to me, and the FT did a story about this. I hate to cite the FT twice in the same episode, but it deserves it at this point. Samaya Keynes wrote a great piece about, has something fundamentally shifted about how people spend their money? And she looked at the U.S., services versus goods. Some things have gone back to the pre-pandemic norm, but some things have not. And this goes to what we were talking about with the UK, Germany, and Japan. We talked about with Egypt. Are there fundamental shifts happening in the economy? And I think there could be that maybe inflation is not going back down to 2 because the underlying makeup of it is different. It's just too early to tell. We just don't know. But this is why we look at this and care so much about it here at the Sun.
And we should graph it out, because the graph is really interesting, because there's a trend line for 10, 15 years that just breaks at 2020, and it has remained broken. It's just off like that.
If there's a good graph out there, we'll find it.
So,
thanks, Gunk.
Or we'll make it.
Or we'll make it. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Guide to the Global Economy. You can subscribe to the channel, hit the button below. In the description, we have a link to sign up for our newsletter where we talk about all these issues. We release them on Sunday night for a small group. We hope you join and read the newsletter. You can follow all of our content on Twitter at ACGeoEcon.